Hi, everyone. So my name's Brandon Hobson, and my book is called Where the Dead Sit Talking, and it's a novel. So we have to get into fiction mode now. I know we've been in nonfiction here. To get into fiction mode, this is a sort of coming-of-age story about a 15-year-old native boy named Sequoia. Specifically, he's Cherokee. It's a novel that explores many themes, such as displacement in the foster care system, the search for identity, and specifically Native identity in a non-Native foster home. There are also questions of gender and of abuse, substance abuse, and finally suicide. There are a couple of reasons I was interested in writing Where the Dead Sit Talking. First, I've been very proud of my Cherokee heritage growing up in Oklahoma, my family history, and enrollment in the tribe. When I was younger, I didn't really understand what it means to be an enrolled citizen and how important that is to my own identity. I do have a passion for helping students, and especially Native students, in helping them become writers, which is why I teach today. When I was younger, I didn't really have a book that I could, especially in terms of a novel, that I could really connect with, that I could identify with as a young person in Oklahoma. And I was introduced to more, the Native literature that I was introduced to was fantastic, and people like N. Scott Momaday, Louise Erdrich, Leslie Silko, and these are writers who are taught a lot. And I was thinking more about the kinds of characters that I really wanted to connect with, and I was having trouble doing that. I did love people like J.D. Salinger, right, who we read in a lot as young people. But part of the older me, as I grew and developed as a writer, I wanted to write about a young person struggling with the same questions of what it means to be Native American and what it means to your identity, especially when you're surrounded by non-Native people who tend to want to dictate for you based on your appearance, on what you wear, and how you define yourself, how you talk. The second reason I was interested in writing Where the Dead Sit Talking was that for 7 years, from 1999 to 2006, I was a social worker. I already had one graduate degree in English and was considering pursuing a second, but instead landed in the field of social work mainly because I needed a job and I needed insurance, and my mom had been a social worker, and so I began working with youth. Over these 7 years, I mainly worked with and I'm using social work terminology here, but what are delinquent and deprived youth. I worked with kids who were incarcerated and kids who were in foster care. I worked with kids who were displaced and whose displacement created a sense of credulity and desperation for an identity, hope, and acceptance. I worked with Native youth who were placed in non-Native foster homes, who searched to understand their identities and also their gender. I was writing at that time, but not about any of these issues in the field of social work. So I lasted only 7 years in social work, but it stayed with me, and I found myself thinking a lot about those lives that I encountered during that time, working with young people. I thought about also the broken system and how even today it's still broken, but it's such an important part of our lives. I thought about the kids I spent time with who were in the shelter or were in various foster placements, shuffled around from home to home. And really how I learned to be an active listener when they broke down, often in front of me, or they just needed to talk to someone for long periods of time. So I listened, and that's really all they needed, was just somebody to listen to them. I wondered, these kids, I wondered after 7 years if they were still around, and what story would they tell of all the ones that they told me. So after that, I went on and pursued my PhD and continued to write fiction. But I kept thinking this idea was swirling around in my head about, how broken the system is and how unfair kids are treated so much. And so after 9 years, I began to write this novel, right? Sequoia's voice came to me, and I knew I had to write his story about being in foster placement. So when I began writing Where the Dead Sit Talking, there were some big questions that came out of this experience. And the first question is, what is home? That was a big question I wanted to explore. What is home? What is home not just to foster kids being shuffled around through shelter and through different foster placements, but also the idea of tribal history. What does it mean to be displaced? What does it mean to be rejected by families, specifically foster families, to sit in youth shelters and juvenile detention centers and not really know where it all stops, particularly for Native youths. In this case, a 15-year-old Cherokee boy whose ancestors were removed from their land by Andrew Jackson and forced west, as you all hopefully know about, in the Trail of Tears, which is one of the worst events in U.S. history. That idea of displacement and coming to this question is, where is our home now, right? And so I was thinking of the connection between the tribes who were removed and also foster kids who were removed. I knew I had to write Sequoia's story within a realistic cultural, historical, and social context. In some sense, this might be considered, in some ways, a post-colonial novel in that it explores questions of power between cultures. It also addresses identity, and it questions cultural independence. In addition to that, of course, the novel explores the consequences of abuse, obsession, and self-harm. And as Sequoia is placed into foster care, his mother is locked up for a nonviolent crime. His mother is locked up, which happens in Oklahoma often for a nonviolent crime. People are spending time in jail for drug offenses, drug possession specifically. And so he finds himself being shuffled around through the system. And he ends up in a non-native foster placement, and connects on some level with an older girl. Sequoia is 15. The girl that is also native that he connects with is 17. Her name is Rosemary, and he finds himself very, very connected to her, not just because of their native identity, but also because he's exploring gender issues of his own. And this book is set in 1989, so where now I think young people are feeling a little bit more comfortable exploring what their gender is. Certainly that was not happening in 1989. So thinking about how students react to this book. Again, as a student, I wish I could have found a book that I could have connected with it, explored Native identity. I hope that this book appeals to students by focusing on more than that, though, more than just Native identity, because of it also exploring gender identity and the pressures at an important time in their lives when they are transitioning into new places and having new dialogues on campus and in the classroom. This is a novel that explores a broad number of themes: abuse, displacement, the foster care system, obsession, and change in social context. The novel is dark in that it's a realistic portrayal of wounded lives. Certain characters' motivations are at times ambiguous, but ambiguity is good for students. When we're talking about fiction, ambiguity helps students develop conclusions of their own. And it helps them think about why the writer made big global decisions and why the writer also made line-level decisions in terms of terminology, word choice. And it helps them, it ultimately helps them form their own conclusions, which is why I feel it's one of the many priceless and immeasurable gifts of reading fiction. My hope is that students recognize the importance of all these issues in my book and how they can spark critical and important discussions. Thank you.